Welcome to Conjuncture. My name is Jordan Camp. I'm really pleased to be here with my colleague, Ibrahim Shikaki. Ibrahim is an assistant professor of economics at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He earned his PhD from the New School. Prior to joining Trinity, he's taught at a number of institutions, including the International University College in Turin, Italy, and both Birzeit and Al-Quds University in Palestine. His work appears in influential journals like the Review of Political Economy, the European Journal of Economics and Economic Policy, anthologies like the Political Economy of Palestine, as well as popular venues including Foreign Policy and Le Monde Diplomatique. I'm very happy to have the chance to speak with him today in Brooklyn about his work on the political economy of Palestine, the economic impacts of the Israeli occupation, and the wave of social protests on campuses against the war in Gaza. So thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me, Ibrahim. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jordan. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Welcome. Well, let's begin with the current situation. As of today, May 5th, 2024, the Israeli offensive has led to the killing of at least 35,000 people in Palestine, the majority of whom are women and children. The destruction is unprecedented in scope and geographical scale. According to the United Nations, it will set back development in Palestine by at least 44 years. You've recently published in 2023 in Review of Political Economy an essay suggesting the relevance of a political economy lens for understanding the impacts of the occupation. So can you talk a bit about how political economy can help us understand this conflict?
Absolutely. I think it is important to look at kind of the structure of the economy and the structural features, or maybe structural distortions is probably the better way of looking at it. Because sometimes when we're looking at features, we think this is endogenous to where we are. But I think structural distortions is a better way of looking at it. And so understanding the structural distortions that can go back, 100 years to where we are today are necessary. And I think one way of looking at that is through class. And so looking both at political economy and class transformation is necessary, because I believe that is what we need in order for us to answer the questions that are relevant today. Why do we have this dependency on the Israeli economy? Why is there a demise in the productive sectors within the Palestinian economy? Why do we have this increasing trade deficit? Why are we stuck in this poverty cycle? And again, if you look back at the end of the Ottoman Empire, right, what you did have is like a slow transformation of class in the sense of concentration of land. And so at the very end of the Ottoman Empire, taxation system changed a little bit. And so a lot of Palestinians did not want to pay taxes. And so what they would do is that they would register the land in the name of one person in a village. And so all of the land of the village was then in the name of one person over there. They would be paying the taxes, the rest wouldn't. So this kind of slowly started to show us a start of that class transformation that I think is relevant. But really it is the Zionist organizations that started working in Palestine, and later the British Mandate, that were core in kind of getting us to where we are today. And so some of the Zionist organizations, for example, the Jewish Colonization Organization that was established in the 1890s. Later on it was called the Jewish Palestine Colonization Organization, the Jewish National Fund, and other Zionist organizations that were operating distorted the triangle, if you want, of the economy: capital, land, and labor. So what would happen with land is, if the Jewish National Fund would buy land, that land would then become property of the Jewish population, right? Which means that Palestinians cannot actually enter the market for that land. But just in general, right, when you have more and more demand for land, what happens is that prices go up, and that means less accessibility for Palestinians. But it wasn't just that, it was also capital. So a lot of the capital that was coming outside was only focused on Jewish industries. It was also labor. All you needed to do was to be part of the Histadrut, or the union for the Jewish labor, and that guaranteed you a job. So you have kind of these small distortions happening. But like I mentioned, I think the British mandate is core. So what the British mandate did politically first, right? You go to Article 6 of the mandate, and it's basically set to facilitate the immigration of Jewish population into Palestine. But economically, I think what it did was really transform the Palestinian economy and the structure of the Arab Palestinian economy at that time. Part of that was through very important economic concessions. So the very first concessions, the electricity power company, the Athlete Salt Company, the Palestine Potash Company, all of those were given for Jewish industries and Jewish business people. If you look at taxation, the taxation, even during the Ottoman Empire time, a lot of it was in kind. Now under the British mandate, it was in cash, which meant less and less people were able to afford it. And then later you had a very interesting tariff policy. So what the British mandate would do, it would actually impose very high tariffs on anything that was produced in the Jewish industry. So chemicals, cement, which meant that those Jewish industries would not have to, at least in the beginning, to compete with external goods. But on the other hand, they would put very low tariffs on agricultural goods, on soap, on olive oil, and that was what the Arab population had at that time. So all of those things kind of ended up not only increasing the size and the weight of the Jewish population in Palestine during the 20, 30 years of the mandate, but also slowly shifting the power in the economy itself from the Arab economy to the Jewish economy. The main transfer that happened was in 1967, right? So when we talk about class formation, perhaps 1967 and the occupation of the remainder of Palestine, so the West Bank and Gaza Strip, was core. And I think it's absolutely necessary to look at class, and you know, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. But it comes from really the very first economic thinkers, or maybe that's not the best way of describing them, the first thinkers who thought about the economy of capitalism. So Smith and Ricardo and Marx and Mill and Say. For them, they really focused on two aspects. One was growth. One was what makes an economy strong and poor. That was the first thing that they were interested in. But the second thing was distribution. So whether it was, again, Smith or Ricardo or Mill or those who criticized the classicals like Marx, really the focus was on distribution. So that's the second part. Ricardo says that the main question in political economy is actually the question of growth and distribution. Now, if you jump, 100 years after that, Robert Lucas, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, said the most poisonous question economists should think about is the question of distribution. So it becomes very, very important, I think, to think about the role of class, not only because those classical political economists were very much attuned to the fact that we can see this kind of difference between classes, and it's not the same today, but you can still argue that for a lot of people who worked on inequality, if you look at functional distribution of income, if you divide the income of the whole economy into income that goes to labor and income that goes to capital, there's much, much more inequality in the income that goes to capital than labor. And so again, there are a lot of interesting questions that looking at distribution allows us to do. In the Palestinian context, that class transformation that happened was Palestinians moving from being self-employed in agriculture to wage workers in the Israeli economy. And that was the major transformation. So in the first 20 years of the occupation, between 1967 and 1987, from 0% of Palestinian labor in the West Bank and Gaza working in the Israeli economy, that jumped to 40%. At the same time, what happened is those of the labor force who were wage workers, right, jumped again from around 30 or 40% to 70%. That was the kind of completion, if you want, of the proletarianization of the Palestinian labor force. And then we see all the ramifications in terms of the dependency, in terms of value added, and where it's actually situated.
Well, I want to ask you about this concept of dependency that I know is right at the core of the work that you do. In a recent chapter that you published in the Political Economy of Palestine, you draw on theorists like Samir Amin, Paul Baran, and others who write about dependency in the periphery of the world system. Can you help us grasp how this concept of dependency can help us explain the military occupation of Palestine, and what changes when you look at it through a dependency lens as against other popular theories like David Harvey's accumulation by dispossession? Yeah. What new do we see?
Yeah, I mean, I always think in economic analysis there are two pillars, Jordan, right? So first you can look at the data and the method. You know, we can talk about that later if you want. But then the other thing is, what is the story that you're trying to tell? Mm-hmm. What is the story there to tell, right? I mean, what is that theoretical underpinning that you have? Mm-hmm. And with the mainstream economic approach, there is this idea of convergence with time. And with David Harvey a little bit, you know, his idea of this new imperialism. What he argues is that the flow of value added is actually reversing. And again, that comes in part because he's focusing a lot on China. But really the majority of work that we have, especially empirically, kind of shows the opposite of that. So whether you're thinking of, you know, people like Ha-Joon Chang, who is, you know, very well-known book, Kicking Away the Ladder, and he's arguing there that what happened is today's rich economies are basically telling the poor economies, these are the policies that you should follow. But in fact, what they did was follow the opposite of them, right? You have Branko Milanovic, who has worked for a very long time with the World Bank, actually, on inequality, saying that the type of inequality that we have has actually shifted from what he calls within inequality, so actually class inequality, to between inequality, which is uneven development between countries. Now, that absolutely does not mean that we don't focus on class, but I think it's more of an internationalization of class and looking at, you know, pools of surplus labor, not only in kind of domestic and national economies, but globally. And so what he shows actually is that, you know, if you look at the 1800s, the difference between the poorest and the richest countries, which at that time were actually, China was one of the poorest countries and the UK was one of the richest, was something like a 20 or 30 to 1. And then if you look at today, that can jump to like 700 and 800 times. So what you actually see is a divergence rather than a convergence. And I think this is where dependency kind of comes in. Dependency has a lot of kind of strands within it, but I really like what Ingrid van Graven does in one of her articles, is kind of looking at it as a research project a la Lakatos, and kind of saying, listen, these are the core tenets of dependency. And the core tenets include understanding that there is an inherent polarizing effect of global capitalism. And I think that is very important to understand. And it's not necessarily only, some dependency theorists have focused on the issue of unequal exchange in the sense of it was poor countries or countries in the periphery that were exporting raw material, commodities, and what you had is finalized goods going the other way around. And I think that's by itself, that might not necessarily be sufficient. I think one of the main things that I like about dependency is that it allows us to look at that production sphere, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, this is very important, and that's, I think, at the crux of it. Marx talks about the production sphere and the exchange sphere. Mm-hmm. And he says what bourgeois economics, what today you could call neoclassical economics does, is only focus on that exchange sphere. Mm-hmm. And in the exchange sphere, everybody is happy. And so I tell my students sometime, right? It's almost like when you go and, let's say you buy a cup of coffee or you buy something. In the exchange sphere, which, again, remember, that means markets. And that's why a lot of today's economics actually focuses solely on markets. If you go buy a cup of coffee, everybody's happy. You have agreed that this cup of coffee is worth $25 or $30, or how much coffee is worth today in places. And the owners or the owner have agreed that this is the price that they're, is sufficient for them. And so you're happy. They're happy, there's the market, you go willingly, and everybody lives happily ever after. Mm-hmm. Even in the labor market, again, if you focus on the market, right, you go someplace, this is the wage that you're paid, they agreed to pay you that, you agreed for that wage, everybody is happy. And if you look at the other side, right, not the exchange sphere, but actually the production sphere, then you start asking, all right, where did we get the beans from that coffee, mm-hmm. right? The workers who worked in the factory who produced that, what is their relationship with their owner? And this is, again, initially what those classical political economists discussed, that relationship between labor and capital. And so in the dependency framework in Palestine, then, you have to talk about that relationship between Palestinian labor and Israeli capital. Mm-hmm. The way that I like to frame it, which is kind of, from my mind, almost like a textbook dynamic, is you have resources moving from the periphery to the core and final goods moving from the core to the periphery. So in the Palestinian context, you have resources, natural resources, land, water, minerals, and human resources, so labor, moving from that periphery to the core. Now, on the other hand, you have final goods moving from the core, from the Israeli economy to the Palestinian one. And so that's why 70 to 80% of Palestinian imports and exports are actually with the Israeli economy. This is where we are today. So I do believe kind of this focus on that relationship between the periphery and the core is not leading to some sort of convergence, but actually it's quite the opposite. What you're finding is, and there's this wonderful book by Eric Reiner 10, 15 years ago called How Rich Countries Got Rich and Why Poor Countries Stay Poor. And I think this is kind of what kind of brought me closer to the dependency approach in general is this, but then as well as, reading not only international authors, but also Palestinian authors. That's something that I'm also very kind of I'm very interested in showing that in the Palestinian context, you also had Palestinian scholars and authors who were writing about this, some in Arabic, but also some in English. And so for me, Adil Samara, for example, is somebody who has been talking about this since the 1980s. Before him, Yusuf Sayegh, maybe not necessarily adopting that framework, but for me, this is something that has been in the discussion there. Unfortunately, after the 1990s and after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority and kind of this shift in alliances between the PLO moving from those revolutionaries in the global south to the US and Western Europe because of international aid, that has shifted a little bit. But I do believe that this is at the core, really, of looking at Palestinian society and the political economy of it.
I really appreciate this. And let me follow up on a couple of things because, one of the things that you highlight on one hand is Israeli capital's, exploitation of Palestinian workers, right? One statistic that stood out for me was that like half the Palestinian workers in construction,
Yep.
right? And so we start seeing the political purpose of these checkpoints, which I hope we can come back to. But there's also this land acquisition for settlements. And as I understand it, that's one of the distinctions the difference makes between accumulation by dispossession and your framework. So I wonder if you could say a bit about, help to our audience understand the kind of specificity of the settler colonial project when it comes to land.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think there are kind of almost two phases of that, if you want. I think a lot of the discussion is right now on the second phase, which is almost like post-1967. So after the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, what has happened with settlements? And for me, it's a very important point because it talks a little bit about the purpose of some of these political agreements, including the Oslo Accords and the Paris Protocol, which is the economic equivalent of the Oslo political agreement. So if you look at, for example, the number of Israeli settlers in the West Bank and Gaza Strip around 1993-94, there were around 100,000. And today you have around 800,000. And so the point is, during the 20, 30 years since that political agreement has come, it's almost like there have been negotiations, right, over a cake while somebody is already eating that cake that is going on there. And so what you have is the Israeli occupation using various justifications to put their hand on land. There's a very nice documentary called The Law on These Parts by Israeli directors. A lot of people are interested in international law, but end up kind of like getting involved in it. And there's a part there that talks about a meeting where Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister at that time, learns of a specific law that allows the state to confiscate land if there is no work done on that land. And so what happens then is he says, okay, I'm going to go on a helicopter. And he goes on a helicopter. And they try to map any land that seems that people have not been working on it to put their hand on it and to confiscate it. Then using things like, this is going to be now a natural reserve. This is going to be now an area where our military needs to train. So you have all the area of today's Israel that is insufficient. We need area in the West Bank. Having said that, the vast majority of area that is completely now controlled by Israel is the area that surrounds Israeli settlements. Mm-hmm. And so that's why you have there both the land, so around 60% of that area in the West Bank today that is called Area C, which is completely under control of Israel, security-wise and administration-wise. That is for the so-called protection of Israeli settlements. And so that is very much different than the disposition that relates to privatization, that relates to financialization. I think it's useful to think sometimes in the role of neoliberalism, in the role of today's capitalism, but not forget kind of the main colonial role. I always tell people when I give lectures, the best thing to read if you want to look at the colonial foundation of the Zionist project is to read the work of Ze'ev Jabotinsky. In 1923, he wrote The Iron Wall, and he talks directly. Ze'ev Jabotinsky is the intellectual grandfather of the Likud party, which Netanyahu is the leader of now. And he's basically saying, listen, you know of instances, he says, my readers know the instances of colonization that we've had around the world. Tell me one instance where colonization happened and the native population was okay with it. Mm-hmm. They're not going to be okay with it. So the only way is force. And I like Jabotinsky because he's very straightforward, and he says things as they are. And that kind of then gives you a better understanding of some of the narrative that is happening today. This idea especially about the relationship of the civilized versus the barbarism of the natives. But I think it's telling in terms of how people thought about it at that time. I tell them today, I tell in my lectures, okay, colonization has a bad rep, people don't like it, but the leaders of the Zionist movement thought about it exactly like that when they envisaged the state of Israel, or the state for the Jewish people.
Yeah, and it reminds me of your important point to take seriously, that with settler colonialism, the point is not only creating a proletariat from a largely peasant population, but also replacing that population. Yeah, and I think losing sight of that, you miss something about the structure of the situation. I was particularly struck in reading your work, Ibrahim, about the focus on the conditions of Palestinian workers and the experience of the checkpoints. Having seen them myself, going to Ramallah only once for a conference, it stays with you. The road gates, the work permits, and you also make the point that the ongoing siege has intensified restrictions on movement, as well as exacerbated unemployment, which was already dramatic and has had a particularly deleterious impact on women and on youth. So can you talk a bit about the conditions of workers and the unemployed?
Yeah, I think one very important aspect to that has to do with the permit system. So initially after 1967, Israel allowed any Palestinian within the West Bank and Gaza Strip to actually enter Israel. There was debate, there was discussion. There was discussion between Ben Gurion and Moshe Dayan. There's a lot of translation of some of the conversation that they had. But Moshe Dayan was thinking more of the economic usefulness of Palestinian labor. And so there was something that was called a general permit, which means you don't need anything. The military commander of Israel allows all of the population in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to enter Israel freely. So they could go work, they could go buy things. Up until the late 1980s, at the first Intifada, what started to happen is Israel started forcing what we call individual permits. And so what individual permits meant was that every Palestinian who wanted to enter Israel had to then go apply for a permit, and there needed to be a security check for them. And also, they would register for the Israeli Labor Ministry through offices in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And so what that did was actually allow for quotas for specific industries and specific business people. That was used to basically limit the bargaining power of Palestinian labor. So on the one hand, obviously, you have very little job security, right? You have very little ability to fight a checkpoint that is closed. If Israel decides we're going to close the checkpoints today, that's it. Palestinians are not allowed to go in. But if you think of what that meant in terms of Palestinian labor, on the one hand, right, Palestinian labor was paid less than Israeli labor. In fact, in a paper that a colleague in Daniel Younesi and I have written, we call this the apartheid wage. So there's a wage that is paid for Palestinian workers in Israel that is higher than Palestinian workers in the domestic economy, but it is less than the wage that is paid to Israeli workers. So that's perfect for the Israeli employers, because they can incentivize Palestinian workers to go work over there, but then it would still boost their profit. So that helped them there. You still have now that income that goes to Palestinian labor, but then it is recycled back to the Israeli economy because of the demise of productive sectors, because Palestinians do not produce. What Palestinians end up paying for is actually Israeli goods. And the third thing it does for Israeli employers is that it pacifies a little bit that Israeli capital and Israeli labor relationship or conflict, right? That struggle there, because it allows them maybe to pay those Israeli workers a little bit higher when you have that. So it's almost like they have this magical kind of faucet where, okay, when we're going through a downturn, we don't need these Palestinian workers. We can say, hey, these are security reasons, blah, blah, blah. Or if they need more labor, they can open up and get more quotas. The thing with the quotas, though, is that it means that you are only allowed to work in a specific sector under that quota. And what would happen is sometimes you would go and work somewhere else using that quota, but then you would be, even though you do have a permit, you would be working illegally. And that meant, again, much less bargaining power for Palestinian labor. Now, all of this is happening while Palestinians are finding it extremely difficult to move actually to work in Israel. So, I mean, there's tons of documentation, right? Palestinian workers wake up at 2, 3 a.m. in the morning to get to the checkpoint at 4, 5 a.m. and to be able to get to their work. I think Israeli leaders and policymakers have always made, even today, have always made this argument that Palestinian labor is much more useful for them than what they call other foreign labor, because other foreign labor, then they stay in Israel, right? They have to live there, they have to pay for their utilities and services. And with Palestinians, even though you're allowed to work in Israel, that permit always says you are not allowed to sleep in Israel. So you go and you come back during the same day. The Gaza Strip was an absolute extreme, because basically after the siege in 2007, you had almost 0% of that Palestinian labor being allowed to work in Israel. And this kind of brings me back to this idea of data and what we mean by Palestinian unemployment rates that you were talking about. The dependency on the Israeli labor market is to the point where I always like to show a graph that shows whenever there are employment opportunities to work in Israel, unemployment rates go down. But if there are less employment opportunities in the Israeli economy, unemployment goes up. And so that's why you see, for example, in the Gaza Strip since 2007, the unemployment rates, if you look not in general in the Palestinian economy, but if you look at the West Bank versus the Gaza Strip, it's always much higher. So before October 7th, if the unemployment rate in the Palestinian economy was around 25 or 26%, it was only 15% in the West Bank, but around 40% in the Gaza Strip. I always tell the story. I would joke with my younger cousin. She lives in Gaza, she lives in Rafah, and she graduated a few years ago from her undergraduate study. And I would tell her, why are you going, to study in college anyway? Do you know what the unemployment rate is for women between the age of 18 and 24? It's 80%. So if you're a woman in the Gaza Strip between the ages of 18 and 24, your unemployment rate is 80%. So it is sometimes useful to kind of differentiate. So that's the Gaza Strip, and you have the siege, and obviously you have very few employment opportunities. But even the West Bank has roughly 700, the United Nations have documented around 700 movement restriction obstacles. Sometimes they're full checkpoints, sometimes they're what we call flying checkpoints, which means there's not necessarily somebody there all the time, but the structure exists. Sometimes it's a gate, sometimes it's a mound. You have different ways of making life more difficult for Palestinians, but also completely controlling the movement of Palestinians. Jeff Halper actually has a wonderful article about this. He calls it the matrix of control of Palestinian lives. And so, I think it's important to understand that Palestinians have to go through all of that to be super exploited in the Israeli economy, to work in sectors that basically Israeli workers do not want to work at. And that's why, like you mentioned, it is roughly 60%, if not a little bit more, working in construction there. But I think it's always been since the first Intifada in 1987, which was the first time that Palestinians said, we're not going to work in Israel anymore. They also said, we're not going to pay taxes to Israel anymore. They also said, we're not going to buy any more Israeli goods. Kind of that was the first Intifada sentiment. And since then, Israel tried at least 2-3 times to replace Palestinian labor. But they have failed in every time because of those advantages that Palestinian labor kind of give to Israeli employers. And so again, that's why I think even data can be misleading in the Palestinian context. When you say the unemployment rate is, let's say, 25% in the Palestinian economy, which anywhere around the world would seem like very high level, I would say that actually underestimates unemployment. Because if you're thinking about the ability, let's say, of the private sector to employ workers, then you really have to take into consideration the fact that first you have 15-20% of the Palestinian labor working in Israel, which means that is an external kind of, if you want, border that can be cut off whenever Israel decides to do so. But then another 15 or 20% who work in the public sector with the PA that completely 100% relies on international aid to pay for those workers. So in reality, yes, you have 25% unemployment, but you have another 35 to 40% of Palestinian workers who are extremely reliant on these direct external forces to be able to be employed. And that kind of putting all of those together is I believe, the real picture that you want. It's a dark picture, but that is how you would describe the Palestinian labor market, at least.
Right. So you have a pool of cheap labor, what Marx would have called a reserve army of labor, the land acquisitions, which are also the most productive land that underdevelops, or I think you've used the term de-develops the Palestinian economy. You mentioned the siege on Gaza. Can you explain to our audience what a blockade is, and in this case, some of its economic impacts?
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand that what it means is, on the one hand, physical, right? So very few Palestinians are allowed to move outside of Gaza. You need a permit. And really, since 2007, the very few people who were allowed permits are those in medical need. And so they've been able to leave. Students sometimes, especially if there's pressure from their colleges or universities, if they are allowed to leave. There was a time where movement was a little bit easier from the Egyptian side, but generally speaking, the Egyptian side is in very close coordination with the Israeli side, which makes it very difficult for that movement to happen in terms of people. And the Gaza Strip is, 60 kilometers times 5 kilometers. I mean, a lot of people don't understand how small that is. So just think of, psychologically what it means for you to not be able to drive more than 10 minutes one way and maybe 30 minutes the other for 15 or 20 years. There's a lot of, great work that is done on the psychological impact, particularly on children, and this focuses on issues of war and the impact on children. But I think just the social fabric and what happens there, I think that's important. Obviously, the other aspect has to do with goods, and that is at the core. There used to be this list that was published by an Israeli organization called Gisha, and they would report all of the goods that are not allowed to enter into Gaza. That includes ketchup, chocolate, some of these minor things that make absolutely no sense, to later what they call dual usage. So apparently fertilizer has dual usage. And so like these small things, which obviously is one of the reasons why we saw some of the initial tunnels that were between Gaza and Egypt. And so if you have the inability of Palestinian labor that relied, by the way, in the Gaza Strip more as a percentage than the West Bank in terms of work in Israel, and then you have the inability for raw material or machinery or a lot of times energy and fuel to go in. And so what you're having is, right, that the largest prison in the world, if you want. Probably prison is the wrong word. Concentration camp, probably the largest concentration camp that you had in the world. Even the Palestinian, fishermen, people who worked in that industry as well, it was completely limited because of the siege, so they were only allowed to go very few kilometers in the sea to access that. So it is a complete siege, complete blockade, goods, people moving, medical equipment, energy, to the extent that an explosion is only an issue of time. And that's where we got today. I feel this is a big part of understanding where we are today, is understanding, yes, the last 100 years, but also what's been happening in Gaza since 2007.
Yeah, and we really need this longer context to appreciate. I think when you're explaining blockade of Lali Khalili's work on the counterinsurgency, the civilian populations are the strategic target, right? So lack of access to water, the attack on infrastructure, right? This is not incidental. This is a part and parcel of the strategy of the occupation, right? I want to talk about the piece you published in 2021 in Foreign Policy. What you've laid out in terms of the inequality is devastating. But in that piece, you point out that as important as a humanitarian response is that it is insufficient. And you say that a failure to account for political economy, and here I'm quoting you, will only entrench the untenable status of the Israeli occupation and likely lead to further violence. I'm closing the quote. So 3 years later and 6 months since this ongoing siege on Gaza, can you elaborate this argument?
Absolutely, and I think this does go back to the idea of what we mean by political economy and the importance of understanding issues of class and understanding the relationship between labor and capital and understanding the relationship, between global powers in the world. I think there was a fallacy very early on after the Oslo process of thinking that we could have development under occupation. I think this is really at the core of it. And so basically any policy, economic or otherwise, was mostly like trying to address the symptoms rather than the disease. So I feel this has kind of been at the core of it. International aid and humanitarian aid, at best failed, but really at worst, if you think about it, basically subsidized the Israeli occupation. And so when I think of failed, one way economists look at investment, so we divide what's called gross fixed capital formation, which is just another fancy word for investment, into two types. Something that we call buildings and non-buildings. So you can invest in buildings. That normally gives you an idea that capitalists are scared, right? Buildings are kind of more secure. They do have some inward and backward linkages, but really they don't generate long-term employment opportunities. So if you want something that is useful, you want to have less buildings investment and more non-buildings investment. And so international aid since the mid-1990s up until today has failed to increase the non-building portion of investment. And so the average in the last 20, 30 years of building investment has been around 80%, and only 20% would be the employment generating investment that you have. So that is one aspect of how it has failed. And again, it's not a surprise that it has failed because it has not been addressing some of those structural issues, including the Israeli occupation. What has failed as well is thinking that we can discuss economics without really talking about politics, right? So that's the idea of having development under occupation. This is not just the problem of the Palestinian Authority. I think this is an issue of economics in general, right? Economics has become more and more apolitical. I'm going to go back again to the classical political economists. What they studied, what they called it, is political economy. It was not called economics. When Smith or Ricardo or Marx talked about what we today call economics, it was called political economy. And again, the issue of distribution was very important. There was a shift that happened in the economics discipline around the end of the 19th century with what we call the marginalist revolution. And so these people are mostly economists who really didn't like Marx and his idea of exploitation. And they wanted to say that this new economic system, that industrial capitalism, was the best economic system. But they were also very much infatuated with physics and natural sciences. And that's why, for example, in economics, some of the main terminology that we use is borrowed from physics, equilibrium. There's a wonderful book by Phil Murawski. He's an economic historian in the late 80s, early 90s called More Heat Than Light. And he talks about this kind of relationship between physics and economics and these people. But basically what they wanted to transform political economy, that asked the political questions into something that is the science of economics. And really the mathematization and increased reliance on quantification in economics comes from that period. Now again, we moved to Palestine, and unfortunately you had even at times Palestinian leaders. So I'll mention Salam Fayyad, who was the prime minister for the time between 2006 and 7 up until 2000 probably 12. And Salam Fayyad was somebody who previously worked at the World Bank, previously worked at the IMF, and he was a banker. And a lot of people write about his time as the neoliberal era in the Palestinian context. And so I think it's very important to understand that one of the main reasons that international aid has failed is because it delinked the political from the economics. But again, Jordan, there's this point that it has not just only failed, but that it has worked to subsidize the Israeli occupation. I mean, if you think about it, what happened in the 1990s with the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, right? Israel says, obviously not under international law, but it kind of says, all right, the responsibility of the Palestinian people is yours, all right? Because before it was actually Israel who was responsible for health, for education, for utilities, for public services. Now it's saying, here you go, Palestinian Authority, now you're responsible for all of this. What didn't happen is a transfer of resources. So the Palestinian Authority did not have its control over borders. It did not have control over natural resources. And even the small, tiny part of that economic agreement, the Paris Protocol, that was useful, which was fiscal revenue, right? It did allow the Palestinian Authority to collect taxes itself. 80% of taxes that the Palestinian Authority collects is actually through clearance and tariff taxes. So it's something that Israel, because it controls border, actually has control. And so what Israel has been doing is using those taxes that it is responsible under the Paris Protocol, the economic agreement, to transfer on a monthly basis to the Palestinian Authority as a political card of saying, hey, you asked for membership in the UN, we're not going to give you the money, right? Hey, you've decided to go to the ICJ, we're not going to give you the money. Hey, you pay money for the families of Palestinians who are imprisoned in Israel, we're not going to give you that money. And so this is, even that part has been kind of taken over in the sense that now the Palestinian Authority has all this responsibilities, but has none of the resources. And here comes international aid, right? So you have all this, large fiscal shoes that you have to fill, but you don't have any resources, so that international aid comes. So on the one hand, that international aid is subsidizing the occupation. In another kind of more direct way, right? Israel knows that when it goes into these cities and villages and towns and destroys, humanitarian aid, international aid will come to the rescue. And so it relies on international aid and humanitarian aid to kind of make sure that the situation is not going to reach that point where Palestinians have actually absolutely nothing to lose on every different aspect. So I do think that it's important to understand that this idea of kind of economic peace, this idea that all you need to do is for Palestinian and Israeli business people sit down together and have an economic solution for a political problem is going to work. And that has just failed miserably all this time. And yet you still find that rhetoric, especially within diplomats and within people in international financial institutions, that all you need is that proximity and relation between the poor and the strong economy, and the poor one will benefit. But again, everything that we've talked about has actually shown the opposite. Everything that we talked about, dependency, is showing that that relationship only allows value added to be realized in the strong economy, not the poor economy. So I do think that it is very important to think about the fact that there is no economic solution for a political problem, right? So the other kind of flip side of it, and I always do mention South Africa in this instance, is that just because that is true, absolutely, right? That doesn't mean that we forget about the economic aspect, and to be more precise, about the political economy aspect. So I always use South Africa as kind of this warning story, right? South Africa got rid of political apartheid, right? One person, one vote. But today South Africa is one of the most unequal countries around the world, right? 10% of the population in South Africa owns up to 90% of the wealth. And surprise, surprise, that 10% is white South Africans. And so in my mind, which even today I understand is very difficult to even fathom, but let's say sometime the next 50, 60 years, we have a political agreement, a political arrangement, let's say a one-state solution, for example, between the river to the sea, and everybody has equal rights and everybody has a vote. I still do believe that that is insufficient, because what will happen is just that kind of reinforcement of Israeli capital, Palestinian labor. That inequality will persist. That inequality is inherent in capitalism. I always tell my students, it's called capitalism, not laborism. So think between labor and capital, who's going to win? And so I think that's very important to keep in mind. Yes, you cannot think of an economic solution or an economic peace, which is basically Netanyahu's idea since the 1990s, very clearly. But that doesn't mean that we forget about that political economy aspect, that distribution aspect, that production sphere that Marx is saying it's important to look at. It is insufficient to look only at that exchange sphere. And even in today's context, I believe, and we don't talk a lot about this, but I think looking at class in the Palestinian context is also important for two reasons that again, maybe we don't discuss enough. The first is the one that you mentioned about the paper that I had written about that structural model. So the result of my paper is saying, who bears the burden of the economic impact of the Israeli occupation? Whether it's Palestinian laborers or Palestinian capitalists, can actually have an impact on growth, on what we call capacity utilization and profit rates and whatnot. So it is important to understand that you also have this relationship of Palestinian labor vis-a-vis Palestinian capital and Israeli capital. That's one aspect that I think is important. But also post-October 7th, I mean, we don't talk a lot about the 20, 30,000 Palestinians from Gaza who were able to go to Egypt because they are families of the rich merchants who bought the golden tickets, right? They were able to pay $5,000 to $10,000. That's the nominal price, sometimes more, to an Egyptian company that, basically got them out of Gaza. And so in one way of looking at this, right, there was a small group that were actually able to leave, and those were the rich capitalists in the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, look at where the brunt of the military machine is. It's in places that are some of the poorest places in the West Bank. In Tulkarem, Nur Shams refugee camp, Tulkarem refugee camp. In Jenin refugee camp. In Jericho, Aqb al-Jabr refugee camp. The small rural towns that are very poor. So even in that aspect, you do see a class angle. I think that is important. Of course, that doesn't mean that there's not like a widespread, like that matrix of control applies to everybody. But also thinking of class in terms of who is bearing more of the brunt, I think is relevant in the Palestinian context.
Yeah, that's part of distribution as well, the distribution of pain away from the Palestinian bourgeoisie. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the student protests on hundreds of campuses across North America, Europe, and beyond, including our own campus at Trinity College in Hartford, and their demand for divestment. Given your expertise in economics, I wonder if you could reflect on what a political economy perspective brings to these discussions, and how can this political economy perspective help us understand the situation in new and distinct ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's going on around campuses is it's absolutely amazing. I think it kind of encompasses kind of maybe 3 or 4 very kind of important changes or elements. And for me, one aspect is really what is going on in US academia. The commodification of higher education, in one sense, the defunding of higher education. I think, on the one hand, that has led, if you want, competition in US academia to focus not really on education, but, the dorms and the sports facilities and whatnot. And in one way, if you think of that, combine that with how much loans that these students would need, there's almost now this focus on US academia as being this necessary step to be able to get a job, to first be able to pay these loans. So what that's done, I feel, is in one way depoliticize campuses. And so if you look at the experiences of campuses from the 60s and 70s compared to today, I think there's much less activism. And so a lot of conversations that I've had with students was about this idea of like this pent-up activism that was in them. And Palestine is just this kind of ideal topic that people coalesce around. And so I definitely think that that plays a role in seeing what is happening. Now, obviously, the other aspect has to do with the level of absurdity, if you want, in what's going on. The number of deaths, the level of destruction is unprecedented, right? I mean, if you're thinking about the women and children, if you are thinking about the number of colleges that have been completely destroyed, right? We're talking about students who are protesting what is happening in Gaza. And Gaza now has no more colleges or universities left. All of them have been physically destroyed. No access to water, right? Basically, people being killed while they're trying to reach food, etc., etc. So I think part of it is kind of the severity of what is going on. I think coupled with that kind of depoliticization that was happening on campuses, and this was kind of like the spark to that. And I think the third thing that is very important is absolutely this idea of, you know, social media and access. I mean, for two reasons, right, Jordan? The first is you do have some mainstream media there, but they're not everywhere. They can't reach everywhere. But it's much easier for somebody on their phone, right? And I know there's a lot of discussion about this with Black Lives Matter, right? I mean, a lot of these things were happening before. We didn't have recordings of them. Everybody knew that these things were happening. So now you have this access of people all around the world because a Palestinian in Gaza has their phone and access to internet. So that is one aspect. They're actually seeing things directly happening there, seeing horrible things happening there. But I think there's even a more nuanced way of looking at it. Yes, social media and TikTok gives you kind of that direct access to seeing what's going, but it's also direct in the sense that nobody is mediating it, you know? So you don't have Jake Tapper or Sean Hannity or even Rachel Maddow telling you what these things mean. You see them, and these, you know, young students are seeing those pictures and those videos, and they didn't need somebody to pacify it for them or water it down for them or twist it for them. They actually see it, and they let their uncorrupt way of thinking analyze them and respond to them. And I feel that is important. Then you connect. So I think there's that part that has to do with, if you want, the political economy of academia in the US and what that has done. But on the other hand, you have then the call for divestment. And I think this is, and I've written about this in Al Jazeera. There's this thing about what's the right type of resistance. I always call the hypocrisy of the West. I mean, divestment in BDS is the ultimate non-violent kind of tactic, right? I mean, I also have some reservations on what we call violent or non-violent, but it's the ultimate non-violent resistance, right? What you're saying specifically with the BDS call, right, is until Israel abides by international law, right? And remember, Israel is now very much wary of ICC arrest warrants. They are already, you know, the ICJ is saying there's pretty much might be a very good chance that there's genocide going here and you should stop doing this and that. And so what the BDS is saying, until Israel abides by international law, yes, we should have these, boycott these companies, boycott the official Israeli state and its bodies, etc., etc. So that's the other aspect of it. And maybe the granular part of it is particularly on weapons, right? Israel prides itself, and this is how it markets its kind of military industrial complex and weapon manufacturing industry is, we have our field tested weapons for you, right? We have tested these on the people in Gaza and the West Bank. They're around, I believe, the war in 2008, 2009 on Gaza, one of the new drones that the Israeli company was producing had the name of like something of a star. And there was an advertisement saying, a star was born over the sky of Gaza. They're talking about a death machine, and they're marketing it by saying this was tested in the Gaza Strip. So I think with weapons particularly, which is a lot of where the divestment is going towards, it's focusing also on this kind of industry that has become globalized very much in that sense, and kind of targeting that as one divestment aspect. So you can think of it in terms of this global capital and the role of using Palestinians as guinea pigs, if you want, in terms of this weapons and machinery of death. But I believe there's also a part, that's why I think it's so interesting that you can talk about that, you can talk about what's going on with US academia, and you can talk about social media. Perhaps the last thing that is also encompassed in this series of events is, the Congress's, hearings of the presidents, right, of US colleges and universities, right? So it becomes a deterrence, right, for not only for the current presidents, but now if somebody's leaving and you're, as a board, are thinking of who the next president is going to be, this is going to be something that you're going to be looking at very carefully, right? Where do they stand on this? Where do they stand in terms of like academic freedom and allowing their students, or are they going to, pick up the phone and call the police as soon as Palestinians, pro-Palestinians and students are protesting? And I think this is kind of another aspect that relates to what's going on. It's, we as Palestinians sometimes we like to think that the world revolves around Palestine and Israel sometimes, but it does seem, if you think about the impact geopolitically, the impact even on the US, the impact on this idea of the US hegemon and what is going around in terms of the influence in the Middle East, it does seem that now Palestine, Israel encompasses a lot of what is happening globally, right? It's an example, it has some uniqueness, but it's an example of what's happening in a lot of other places. And it just happens to be that, the United States is, Israel is the country that the United States gives the most aid to around the world. And so you see a lot of reaction happening here in the US, but you're also seeing it all around the world. And I think, it is partly because of all of those developments together. And I think the response that is going right now in terms of administration, in terms of what the police is doing, is probably going to be, is going to have an impact on the reaction of future kind of student movements, labor movements on campuses. In my view, actually, what it's going to do is kind of bring back the politics of activism on campuses, not just on Palestine, but just the fact that for a very long time there was much less of that activism on campuses.
Yeah, and there would be those who would want to distinguish between the 60s protest and the protest of today, but one of the things that came to mind as you were speaking is that, of course, in the late 60s, what were those campus protests largely about? Linking civil rights to the struggle against the war in Vietnam. Of course, we think of Martin Luther King's speech at Riverside Church about, justice being indivisible. And the protests of today, likewise, I think, are refusing to accept a separation between, the domestic and the foreign, what's happening in the U.S., what's happening in the world. And the point you make about the U.S. support is not a small one. I mean, the U.S., the most powerful capitalist state with the largest military in the world, spends more on weapons than the next, I think, 7 or 8 countries combined, right? And as you said, Israel is the largest recipient of those resources. So the connections are quite direct, and the students are astute, I think, in drawing out those structural connections. I would love to talk with you all day, but I know that you have urgent tasks in front of you with your research and teaching, Ibrahim. But is there anything that I haven't asked that you would like to add?
Well, I mean, not necessarily a topic, but I do have to say that I'm a little bit disappointed by academic institutions in terms of some of the things that faculty and bodies can actually do. I think students are doing a great job, but I think we in academia, there's a lot that we can do to pressure administrations. I mean, part of it is just inviting Palestinian speakers, right? Even if via Zoom from Palestinians who are over there, trying to teach more courses on the Middle East and Palestine, bringing Palestinian voices, partnerships with Palestinian universities. I mean, it seems that there's a lot in common between a lot of what goes on in the US. I feel, especially, people who are working on social justice, that there's a lot that can be linked. I was giving a webinar with the Association for Heterodox Economics, and I was telling them that there's a lot that heterodox economists can and should do, right? And they should think of organizing visits for faculty to go to Palestine, organizing conferences with colleagues in Palestine. I do feel that sometimes a lot of the solidarity happens on campuses here, kind of in relation to these people over there, without actually connecting to those people over there, because people there are also economists and sociologists and political scientists, and there's a lot in common in research. So I think this is a good opportunity to go that extra step. And what I really like about demands for students everywhere, including at Trinity and including at places like Brown Northwestern, was calls for more academic cooperation, right? Everybody in their own field, but for us in academics, I think we should do more to pressure our administrations to involve more Palestinian voices, to involve kind of topics that can relate to that, to bring in students, to send some of our students to study there and to connect there. I think that's very important in kind of the role that academia can play in the very small space that we have. I think it's important for people in academia to know that, you have your people there, right? It's not going to be very difficult for you to get in touch with them, and you definitely should do that. That would be my message, I guess.
I really appreciate that. And as you said that too, I wouldn't want to miss the opportunity to, in addition to highlighting what's been good about Northwestern, about Brown, about Trinity, about Wesleyan in terms of a space for dialogue, but also to send a message of solidarity to faculty and students who are being massively repressed at UCLA. I think of the images we've seen this week at Dartmouth, obviously at Columbia, at Barnard, the arrest of the students at the new school. This escalation of repression is unlike anything I've seen on these campuses in my career. Does that resonate? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking, having conversations with colleagues and faculty here about images of Israeli soldiers beating up Palestinians especially around the areas where there is kind of that direct contact, so in Jerusalem and in Hebron, and then seeing what's going on, and I see kind of the similarities, and all of them remind me, right, as if I need reminding, right, that there is very strong cooperation, right? That police here is also very much connected with the Israeli army and Israeli police, that they have joint training programs together. So I think that's also important to keep in mind, right? It's not just in theory, but also in practice that connection exists. So it's not surprising, if you didn't know the surroundings and you saw what was going, you wouldn't be able to differentiate where this is happening.
Right. And the outright destruction of Palestinian universities, right? Scholasticide is the term I've seen scholars and activists employ draw attention to the devastation as it unfolds. It's been my pleasure to speak with you today. Ibrahim Shikaki, thank you so much for joining us. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you. I had a great time. Thank you, Jordan. I appreciate you. Appreciate your patience as well.
And I also want to thank our viewers and listeners for joining us for this episode of Conjuncture. Stay tuned.